today about the minimum wage for articling students. It's an issue that sort of erupted in the last convocation in November. I think, Alexander, you are the vice chair of the Professional Development and Competence Committee, and both you and Jared are on the committee. You want to maybe give us a little bit of sort of what happened to you on Twitter as a result of, the decisions that came out of convocation and the debate?
Yeah, sure. So I unfortunately missed a lot of the debate and convocation. I had a pre-trial the same day and wasn't able to take part there. So the best I could do was sort of engage after the fact on Twitter and try and explain the issues and where PDNC was sort of coming from with our position and why we felt the recommendation in 2018 to impose a minimum wage floor wasn't the right call. Long short, basically, we acknowledge it's a bottleneck. Articling, it's a problem, and we'll discuss this more. There are thankfully other paths. There's the LPP, or if you've sort of gone through the Lakehead program, you could sort of just avoid articling altogether. But articling is a bottleneck, and 10 to 15% of the current placements are unpaid, or below the minimum wage threshold, and are at risk if we impose a minimum wage of just being lost. So
let me cut you off there for a second. So how many articling students are there every year in Ontario? Do we know? Is that a number that's readily available?
Yeah,
more or less.
Yeah. In 2020 there were 1,936 articling placements. In 2021 that number has slightly increased to 2,067 after it had dropped. So the 2020 number was in fact a drop from 2019, probably attributable to the shutdowns from the pandemic. But you're roughly looking at about 2,000 positions of articling placements every year. And I think there's something like 2,730 candidates that go through the practical experience process. So that would there's 2,730 applicants in any given year that are either coming through the articling process or through the LPP programs that are at Ryerson and the French language
I think Lakehead
program at Ottawa.
Yeah, and Lakehead has recently brought that up as well.
Those are two different things. So that Lakehead, Boralaskin, and Ryerson Law School have the IPC, which is the practical component introduced into the curriculum of the law school. You graduate with it. The LPP program is a separate component. You could have gone to a traditional law school curriculum, and then you undertake the LPP program in the French language program at Ottawa alternatively. So there's slightly different situations, but yeah, bottom line is you have about 2,730 applicants. You've got about just under 2,000 articling positions available in 2020.
And so, Alex, you're saying about 10% of those articling students or total applicants might take an unpaid gig, is what you're saying?
I believe the number is 10 to 15% of the current articling placements are below the threshold that would be sort of cut off if we were to impose the minimum wage. And so that would increase the bottleneck. And currently, I believe there's 500 or so people looking for placements or in the process of finding placements. So there's already more demand than there's supply. And that's sort of where this debate comes to. And one of the key issues of the debate, from my perspective, that just as articling currently exists, where there is a bottleneck, we don't want to do anything to increase that and make it worse.
Interesting. Okay. All right.
So about 150 to 200 placements in 2020 were either unpaid or below what was the minimum wage floor that was being reviewed by the committee in 2019 and 2020. So no minimum wage has actually been passed. No minimum wage has been erected or implemented. It was put to study, and the wage that was being discussed, 150 to 200 of the placements would have been below that or for no compensation at all.
And give me a little bit of history. Where did this come about? Like, this was a policy, from my understanding, that started in 2017 from the previous group of benchers. Did you guys at the committee level dive into some of that as well, and then sort of debate that, or maybe, Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, people need to understand that this is not a new issue at the Professional Development and Competence Committee. It's been coming up every year. But absolutely, 2017, 2018, the last bench, if you will, decided to put in what they called articling enhancements, which are essentially regulatory burden and to some extent financial burden on articling placements. Those burdens, if you will, included a mandatory practice audit for any principal who sought to hire an articling student. It also required mandatory training for any articling principal who sought to hire an articling student. And then finally, they were going to erect a minimum wage floor on the placements. And that was the previous convocation's efforts to address the crisis in articling. Now, to some, the crisis in articling is that there are not enough positions, that there are currently 500 people who came through the licensing process over the last 3 years who have not found an articling position and cannot get called to the bar. To me, that's the crisis. To most normal people, that's the crisis. However, the previous bench decided to focus in on the results of an articling survey that had gone out in 2016, 2017. There was a survey sent out to, I believe it was the 2 cohorts of individuals who came through articling in 2015 and 2016. So I think it was sent out to about 5,242 people received this survey asking them, what's your experience with articling like? And only 1,479 or 471 people bothered to even respond. Okay, so the response rate was 28%. That's it. Now, what caught the previous bench's attention was that of those 28% of respondents, approximately 19% of those had reported experiencing negative comments, discriminatory comments, and about, I believe it was 17% of those respondents had indicated that they experienced differential treatment or discriminatory treatment on the basis of a protected ground under the Human Rights Code. And that's the number that's been widely reported, is 19% of respondents said this, 17% of respondents said that. The problem is that fun with numbers is something that seems to be typical in the policy development exercises of the Law Society. What they're calling 19 and 17% of respondents is actually 0.05% of the number of people that actually received the survey and didn't bother to respond. 0.04% of people who received the survey came back reporting that they had experienced differential treatment. Now, these are horrible things. Differential treatment and unwelcome comments clearly are not something we want to see. But the numbers aren't quite as significant as what the public and perhaps the policy-making boards have been told they are. You hear 19 and 17%, you're thinking, wow, that's something significant. When you hear 0.05% and 0.04%, that changes things a little bit, and it also then changes the policy response. Well, faced with that, the last bench decided there's a grave crisis here. We better go after articling principles and placements. And so they did. So they erected those regulatory burdens I just indicated to you. And however, the new bench came in and
so let me just unpack that for a second. So the old bench wanted a mandatory minimum wage, a mandatory audit of articling principles, I would imagine at a certain way through the articling process, and a mandatory educational session or training for articling principles. Is that about right?
Yep.
And Alex, this is kind of near and dear to you. You articled not too long ago. You're the youngest bencher on record in the history of the LSO. So it was a big honor on your end. What was coming out of your articles? What was that experience like? What were some of these issues and discussions like?
So in what sense, in terms of?
Well, I mean, how long ago did you article?
So I was quite lucky in terms of how my experience worked. I was an NTA student, so I came from abroad, but I had a sort of summer or just student placement at a firm downtown Toronto, and they took me on as a student and had me for sort of period while I was doing my conversion exams. And then because of that prior period, I only had to do half the traditional articling period. So I had a bridge period of only 5 months. But
Nice.
yes, it was a very good experience, but it was paid. So I know there was some debate we can get into on Twitter about whether or not that disqualifies me from talking about minimum wage, but I feel it doesn't. And I feel the issues remain the same, and I'm still making a point that remains valid whether or not I was paid as an articling.
And when you got into the history of it, sort of like as Jared was, discussing, was there anything that kind of stuck out to you? I mean, on the numbers, it seems to me numbers can be used one way or another to justify, either position one way or another. I do think that, response rates and surveys and dealing with how the surveys can be framed can be problematic at times, depending on what you're looking for, or tailored for specific results. But it seems that the focus of the old bench was more on the experience of the articling student as it was dealing with the initial problem that the articling students were, the positions that the articling students needed to have take up.
I'm not necessarily faulting either staff or the prior bench or anyone, but there does, from sort of my limited experience as a bencher, seem to be a tendency to conduct these surveys, send them out to everyone, and then from the extremely limited response, basically extrapolate the result up to everyone and say, this is fully representative of everyone, irrespective of the fact that the people that chose to respond may have certain biases. And that's unfortunately not a sound way of conducting and sort of making policy, and it is problematic. So that looking into that was sort of the issue. And irrespective of where you think the numbers land, the key for us and sort of new bench and BD&C was basically just reduce the regulatory burden and try and achieve the same goals without sort of making things worse for people. And so yes, with articling, there will always be sort of non-standardized experience, because that's the nature of going to someone's practice. A family lawyer will give you a very different experience from a downtown corporate lawyer, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, you're still, the best you can do, and sort of the best we should do, is rather than sort of random audits and increase the risk that like you're going to have all your paperwork in order to a degree that's just frustrating and makes having an articling student even more cumbersome. What we've instead put in place is if an articling placement ends early, then we look into it and say, okay, what happened here? We ask the student, we ask the principal, and we get sort of a more sensible sort of risk-based approach to let's deal with this and take a look at it. And that's less burdensome on everyone.
So that's a little bit of what the new committee sort of had come to Convocation recommending. You're getting into a little bit of that. So give me, what were the 3 or 4 points, if you don't mind, on that?
Sure. Okay, so we replaced the mandatory training with recommended training. It's still a good package, and the point is these modules that we passed, the idea is for this to actually be valuable information that people want to look at. And so people will look at it that are inclined to do a good job, and that will remain the case. But it's not something that, okay, you have to sort of confirm with us and fill out the paperwork and do all that. And it doesn't add any extra burden in that sense. In terms of the audit, it's just, as I said, sort of the risk-based audit. There's no sort of minimum floor on the wage, because we're encouraging people to to obviously pay people, because if you're making money, you should. And obviously, if you're adding value, and if you can, it obviously helps. Obviously, people are in law school in a miserable sense. And
I don't think anyone anyone that I've heard at Convocation or any of the 3 of us thinks that anyone should work for free, whether articling student or otherwise. I mean, a minimum wage or an acceptable wage should be in place no matter what.
In an ideal world, absolutely, everyone should be paid. It's just, look, articling is the only option in terms of people that want to article. Anyone that's in the marginalized position, and that's what it comes down to, people that do not have the option of a paid placement. Their only options are to go to a different lawyer and say, hey, please let me work for you for either underpaid amounts or for free. Let me gain this knowledge that I did not get in law school, and I need to be a competent practitioner either by myself or at a firm down the line, and let me get through the process. And either that or the LPP. If we take away the option with the minimum wage, everyone goes down the LPP route. And the problem also there is LPP currently does involve unpaid placements. So if we put on a minimum wage, does this apply to the LPP too? And if it does, we may have a similar issue with bottleneck potentially we run into. So who knows? Like
how big is the committee? The PDNC committee? How many members are we talking about here?
Oh, I should know this off the top of my head.
Well, PDNC, as it's known, is one of the biggest, the bigger committees. It's definitely an important one. It deals with professional development and competence. So it's definitely the the one that's that all of the benchers are typically vying to be a part of.
13.
13, including the chairs.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And I cut you off, Jared, and you were going on to the numbers, but I'm just wondering, like, is this, was there, I know we can't get into how individual committee members, what positions were sort of given by individual committee members, but in general, what was the consensus overall? What was the feeling or the trend in the committee process? How long was this discussed? Was this a one and done discussion, or was this something that took place over a little while?
No, the initial conversations about this change in policy started in 2019 at that committee. I wasn't even a member of the committee.
But you attended.
They've continued since 2019. This has been going on 2 years. The majority of the committee, going back to 2019, and now the current committee, the majority believe that we've got to address the real problem, and that is the 500 candidates who have come through the licensing process in the last 3 years, who can't get their articles signed, who can't find an articling job, that we need to be looking at them. Now, the last bench, as I said, they were looking at a different cohort, and that was the cohort who responded to the survey, who said that they had negative experiences. 200 people who indicated that they had negative experiences. Who are we going to assess? Who are we going to direct policy towards? And with the onset of COVID, the imperative became much more important, according to the majority of the committee, that we need to do all we can to ensure that there are articling positions out there to allow licensing candidates to get called to the bar, to not allow articling to become an artificial barrier to the entrance into the legal profession. And how can we do that? Do we saddle those remaining articling placements with more regulatory and financial burden? Listen, I'll give you my own experience, but my experience is shared by the majority of this committee, and that is I've been an articling principal several times. I take pride in that. We've brought through many articling students, and they've stayed with us. We paid them all. I firmly believe it ought to be a paid position. But I've also been subjected to practice audits, more than one. And I can tell you, they're not fun experiences. Even though, we've all come through our audits and there's no real issues that come out of it, the preparation for an audit and then the actual experience of an audit is not something that's fun. And so if we're going to ensure that more people in the profession step forward and do what is this community service, this public service of creating articling placements, do we make that job harder? Or do we look at ways in which the Law Society can work as a partner, a regulatory partner with the profession to see that these opportunities continue? And so, I mean, that's basically what the majority of the committee has been saying before I even got there, since 2019, under different chairs, with different membership. They've all recognized that. So it's not easy. I mean, clearly talking about minimum wage floors is an incendiary and an emotional thing. But the way I personally look at it, and I can't speak to the committee, but the way I personally look at it is the people that are typically taking on positions that are unpaid have nowhere else to go. Okay, we're not dealing with the Bay Street crowd who are making $110,000 a year to article. These are different people that are either coming through non-traditional paths like NCA, like Alexander, or they're people that don't have broad networks and available to them, and the resources available to them to find positions. And talking about these 500 people, for instance, that didn't find articling placements, who am I to say to them that they can't approach some sole practitioner on the street and say, hey, let me come in, sign my articles, let me become a lawyer? And the lawyer says to them, well, I can't pay you. Well, guess what? The Law Society with a minimum wage floor says you can't, you're not allowed. That placement can't go ahead. Who am I to take away that person's freedom and their ability to enter the profession? And so, yeah, it's nice to mandate a minimum wage, But you're then taking away the freedom to contract. You're taking away the ability of these individuals, the ones that least can afford it, to find places that might have mutuality of interest. I get called to the bar, you get an articling student for a period of time. Now, and we need to talk about that period of time as well, because I think that's important.
Yeah, I think I know where you're going. I mean, on my end, you and I have had some good discussions about, whether we should do away in general with articling and move to a US model. And, I guess from that perspective, I wonder what's articling designed to provide the articling student with. Is it skills development? Is it just a little bit of experiential training? Is it something, quantified a little differently in terms of from the Law Society's perspective that they wouldn't get if we just changed the title of that to first year associate?
So I think articling is a good program. I went through it. I had a 10-month articling term. It was good. And I think that there can be value to good articles. The problem is the Law Society cannot guarantee that. They cannot guarantee good articles. And yes, I was taking dry cleaning to the dry cleaners for my principal, but in between that, I learned a hell of a lot. And so can the Law Society guarantee the quality of someone's articles? I think the answer is no. I think that articling is one of those things that has become an unfair barrier to the profession that disproportionately impacts certain communities. I think personally it should be abolished because of those two things, but I also understand why, it has value. It's a good thing. Good articles are a good thing, but let's not fool ourselves. I mean, I did a 10-month articling program. The current bench has reduced that in the face of COVID, recognizing the number of positions is going down precipitously, and it's harder to do when you're having virtual engagements as an articling student. We permitted that those be reduced to 8 months, from 9 and then to 8. But it can be even abridged further than that. You can apply to the Law Society to abridge it. And my understanding is you can abridge your articles down to as little as 4 months. So, and then talking about the LPP placements, my understanding is those are about 4 months. So we're not talking, years of indentured servitude. If someone decides that they want to go for an unpaid position, or that's all that they can get, we're talking possibly 4 months, maybe 8 months. And yes, I understand they're graduating with significant debt, as did I. However, is the position of is an articling position really meant to be something that pays down student debt, student loans, and the choices that students may have made according to which law school they went to, or is it about something else? And so, as long as we're going to have articling, I think the current PD&C committee has found the right balance about trying to make sure that there's enough opportunities out there, that there isn't downward pressure on the numbers, that we're not regulating these things out of existence, but that we're allowing enough flexibility, not only in providing some educational opportunities, but also for principals, but also in allowing students to shape the duration of that engagement.
And Alex, I mean, any thoughts on your end? Jared and I have been stealing.
I think Jared covered pretty much everything. The only thing I will add is basically, as it currently stands, I agree it's a bottleneck and it's a problem that needs to be addressed. Abolish it, or send everyone down the LPP, or some other alternative in place. We'll see. We've got the competence task force sort of looking at this and trying to deal with it. But as it currently stands, sort of my experience as an NTA student, I came out of law school completely unprepared to practice. And it was that firm experience, then the articling experience, that taught me how things work and how to actually sort of manage practice on sort of a very base level, how to actually procedurally navigate things, and all the key things that you need to actually sort of be a practitioner. And you especially as an NCA student, but I've talked with a lot of sort of local students in Ontario law schools, and it's basically, from what I hear, the same thing. You are not taught how to practice. So you come out of law school incomplete and unready, especially if you plan as a sole practitioner, which is a huge portion of the legal world in Ontario. You really don't know what you're doing. And we need some alternative to get people that knowledge. And articling as it currently stands is a key chunk of the educational process that people need. So it's a difficult problem.
I tend to agree. I mean, I want to give one of those, when I was your age in legal years line, when I came out, we had to do, it was 10 months and we had to do, I think it was 3 months of skills development. We had a skills portion where we learned how to run motions, how to close a real estate file, how to do a client interview, how to maybe do a discoveries, if I remember correctly. So we practiced those things in our skills development. Not everyone loved the courses; they kind of hated them, but we did them. We suffered through them, and then when we went into practice, we had a resource at least on where to look to try to remind ourselves.
Well, you're talking about the bar admission course.
Yes, the bar admission.
Oh yeah, well that's gone, right?
Yeah.
So the trend on this stuff is to get rid of that stuff. And why did we get rid of that stuff? Because people decided that was an unnecessary 4-month period of time in order for people to actually become lawyers, right? And I agree with you. The materials and the resources that we gleaned through the bar admission course, the one where we actually show up at Osgood and sit through the classes, that lived with me for the first 5 years of practice. I thought it was invaluable, probably more so than the articling term. But we did away with that, right? And so the resistance to change on these issues, on how people become lawyers, we really have to keep in mind, what is the public interest here? What is the public interest here? Is it to decrease the number of articling positions? Is it to weigh them down with regulatory and financial burden? Is it to turn off articling principals from their duty, I say, their public duty, to create these positions? Or is the public interest in favor of perhaps loosening the regulations, perhaps not micromanaging everybody's articling engagement, and thereby trying to increase the supply of these things? We want, dare I say, the public interest is more lawyers that are competent. And if that is the public interest, that more lawyers who meet the minimum competence, then we need to do everything in our power to ensure that our licensing process isn't preventing the accomplishment of that goal.
Yeah, and I think, I think that the test we're seeing from Ryerson and Lakehead with this integrated practice curriculum, or the LPP program with Ryerson, is a good sort of instructive model. And I see a lot of the skills development that we did away with in the bar exams now coming and finding its way back into the curriculum. And it might be something that's being put onto law schools, or we see in the next bunch of years being put onto law schools. Of course, that's just my instinct on it. I don't know.
The problem with that, though, is that not everyone that goes to law school is intending to practice law. And so licensing and the law societies or regulated are focused on those who go into the practice of law and the provision of legal services. That's not the cohort who are in the law schools.
Yeah.
To a great extent it is, but that's not 100% of what's going on in the law schools. And so they have a very different mission than us. And the other thing is, people go to different jurisdictions to practice after they leave Ontario law schools. Similarly, you've got the NCAs who are coming from outside the jurisdiction. So as the regulator, for lack of a better phrase, we've got to focus in on our knitting, and that is those who are going to provide services within Ontario, legal services, and deal with how we enter them into the profession and ensure that aligns with the public interest. We can't worry about what law schools are doing because we live in a global environment where our lawyers who come into the licensing process are more and more often coming from very different jurisdictions, very different scholastic backgrounds, and that's a good thing. So we need to focus in on our knitting, and that is the public interest in the provision of legal services. And I think trying to downward look at what law schools are doing, I think is parochial and myopic.
So when you say 2,700 articling positions or students looking for positions every year, does that include NCA candidates as well? Do you know?
I believe it. Yeah, I think it's 2,730 in 2020, and that was going through all the different streams.
Interesting. All right. And I'm just wondering if the number of lawyers and maybe paralegals, but number of lawyers has kept pace with the growth in number of lawyers per year, have kept pace with the growth in the population in Ontario. I mean, I don't think it's possible with immigration policies and what's been happening in terms of newcomers, but we're at 14 million in Ontario, and I think full fee equivalent lawyers is somewhere in the range of 44,000. I could be wrong. And I think it's 30,000 that are in solo firms. So small firms. Yeah,
I don't know the population growth in Ontario, but I can tell you that since 2016, there's been an 18% increase in the number of candidates that come through the licensing process of the Law Society. Now, has there been 18% increase in the general population of Ontario? I don't know. I also don't know what the ratio of lawyers and paralegals to members of the public is ideal. I don't know what that is, but you know, we're not supposed to be a monopoly. We're not supposed to be artificially increasing the rates of lawyers or controlling what lawyers are able to charge, bill, and pay themselves. That's not the public interest. The public interest is ensuring that access to justice is met, that the availability of legal services exists. To some extent, we have to preserve the integrity of the profession in order to meet those objectives. But we're not supposed to be monopolistic, guys. We're not supposed to be sitting there and saying, well, hourly rates are dropping down to $100 an hour, and that's a bad thing. So we should put the brakes on how many lawyers we bring into the profession. And to some extent, this minimum wage debate gets very close to that. Is that, should we be concerned about the wages that lawyers are paying themselves or paying others around them? Is that really what the public interest that the regulator is charged and tasked with guarding? Is that really in the public interest? I don't know.
How would you police this stuff? Did you guys talk about that at the committee? How would you go and enforce this minimum wage thing? Would there be, what was the idea around that? Any discussions on that, Alex?
The original package as passed in 2018 was still in its very, very early steps, courtesy of sort of when COVID happened and the need to sort of shift priorities and reevaluate whether what had been passed was the right call or overly burdensome. So we didn't get to that stage of actually costing it out and working out how it would work, but obviously there would be some difficulty there. And like part of the problem we're dealing with is just making sure the budget is balanced, not dipping too far into the general funds. And every time we have a new project that requires an FTE, it starts adding to the budget. And that's how we've had mission creep and loss of sort of core mandate. And that's where we are now and what we're dealing with and trying to reduce. So it's yet another thing where we would sort of step into a new area and it never ends.
Yeah, I mean, people need to understand that lawyers and legal professionals and articling students are exempt, or the Employment Standards Act does not apply to them. And you can argue with whether or not that should have been the case, but it's historically been the case for a very, very long time. I imagine that part of that was because we were deemed to be sort of the sophisticated investor exemption to the Employment Standards Act, meaning you come through a law school, you've got some form of legal training, it becomes more difficult for you to then lean on this argument that there's inequality of bargaining power when you enter into some sort of contract, be it employment, articling, or otherwise.
Sure. So when you come out of law school, you're technically a lawyer, you're just not licensed.
Yeah, and more and more, I'm seeing that people are trying to take that position that they are unsophisticated, that there is inequality of bargaining power, and sort of layer on traditional unsophisticated employee concepts into legal opportunities. But the reality is, historically, it was exempted from the ESA, partly because we're self-regulating profession, but also to some extent because there was recognized that these are some reasonable level of sophistication if you've gone through some sort of legal program. Anyway, where I'm going with all that is we would have to erect our own apparatus at the regulator in order to police this, as you say. We are not the Ministry of Labor, so we would have to hire people to monitor these things. And where it becomes difficult is not only are you adding full-time employees in order to do that, but then you're all having to then assess different manners in which different people are paid. And so, for example, we're assuming everyone will get a straight salary. Well, that's not always the case. Sometimes there's honorariums attached to articling positions or bonuses, if you will. We'll pay you X amount if you complete the program. There's some that they get their expenses paid. I'll pay for your robes. I'll pay for your parking. I'll pay for your mileage. Whatever it is, I'll pay for your licensing dues, which are not insignificant at this point. I mean, there's all manner of different ways in which people are paid. And so we'd have to have basically an in-house Ministry of Labor who's going to go out and audit these things and respond to complaints and issue reports. And then there's going to have to be an appeal mechanism, obviously, like there is at the Ministry of Labor, where articling principals can appeal the decisions that have been made. So you're erecting essentially a Ministry of Labor apparatus, an Employment Standards Officer apparatus within the regulator, and that comes at a cost. Everything comes at a cost.
It's not really, I mean, if we look at it from a perspective of Parliament's intention, I mean, the Employment Standards Act has specifically excluded some groups, and law students or lawyers are one of those groups that are specifically left out. So I have to imagine that, maybe it's a lobbying thing. Do we go to the government? And if it was a matter of having a law change, but to a certain extent, Parliament has spoken, and maybe it's time for that to change. I mean, I don't think that there is an equal bargaining position in that law student or articling, principal versus articling student relationship. Definitely, I think the articling principal is in a much, more powerful position with respect to bargaining. But there is a level of sophistication, I think, that lawyers or law students have when they come out of law school. That's over and above someone working for minimum wage someplace.
Yeah, there absolutely, obviously, people coming out of school have different burdens and suffer from different issues that are facing their personal situation that may cause them to enter into engagements that might jeopardize their own self-interest, if you will. But at the same time, they have other interests that can be met by taking on articling placements that may not meet all of their objectives, specifically taking an unpaid position because you want to get your articles signed to become a lawyer. I mean, that's basically it. And so, yeah, you could have a ton of debt. You could come from a marginalized community. You could have any manner of injustice in your life, but getting to become a lawyer and getting your articles signed may trump all of those considerations in the context of a discussion or a negotiation on an articling placement. I don't know. But should I and Alexander and you and the Law Society be taking away someone's ability to negotiate or contract freely? Should we be taking away their ability to find out what those interests are on their own and try and achieve them? And that's effectively what the last convocation was doing, is they were eliminating the freedom of contract of a certain cohort coming into the profession.
And I guess the last group of benchers thought that, or the committee members thought that their actions would increase the number of articling positions being taken up by principals, or it would increase the experience that articling students would go through. And this group has now said, we don't believe that's the case. I mean, ultimately, we're saying the majority of the committee said, if we do this, this could have the impact of limiting the amount of articling positions. Is that what the feeling was?
Well, no, I mean, they weren't looking at trying to increase the number of articling positions the last convocation. That was not their focus. Their focus wasn't on the crisis in articling, which is the disappearing positions. Their focus was on regulating the quality of the remaining placements, and that's what their measures were tasked with focusing on. This bench is more worried about the crisis in articling, I venture, and that is that we have a dwindling number of positions and it's going down every year, and we need to do something about that if we're going to keep articling. And so, yeah, I mean,
was there a discussion about incentivizing, perhaps giving a discount on fees somehow? I know lawyers in Ontario would love a discount on fees if they took in an articling student, but just wondering if that was something that came up.
I don't recall the specifics of the discussions, but we looked at all manner of ways in which we could basically save the existing positions and increase them. One of the arguments that's come up in the debate on the minimum wage is, well, this current bench hasn't undertaken a study to show that putting in a minimum wage floor is going to decrease the number of positions. And I simply turn back and say, aside from solid economics that will suggest that that's in fact what happens, the last convocation didn't undertake any sort of analysis to see whether a minimum wage would decrease the number of positions. So, holding the current bench to a higher level of
higher standard,
higher investigation and evidence gathering when it builds policy, I think is a rather shrewd debate tactic, but it's not reality.
So I saw a newspaper article in the Star. It was online. It's not in the newspaper, it was online. And they talked a little bit about this concept of equitable access to the legal profession, that this is all about access to the legal profession. And I'm imagining, Alex, you also got a lot of heat and a lot of emotion on Twitter after the reaction. At one point, you I think you had said you just couldn't respond to everyone. What kind of impressions were you getting? What was the, how many hits were you getting? How many direct messages were you getting?
So it's actually been good in terms of engagement. Most people are respectful, and there has been a lot of sort of, even if I had to stop for a little while on Twitter, I've had a lot of chats either on Zoom or with calls with people and just sort of discuss the issues. And there are a lot of good debates, and a lot of debates that I have with these people on both sides of the issue are mirrored in what the sort of debates that we had at PDNC. Like, to give you one example of what I sort of hear a lot of is, especially some of the people that work more at the downtown sphere, where there tends to be, for the younger associates, just there is always more work, and that's just the way things work. That's not what I've seen and what I've heard from a lot of sole practitioners, especially in rural communities, where A, it's more feast and famine, and B, sort of there's always the practitioner in their own firm has enough time, if they wanted, to do all the work themselves at their billable rate. So one of the suggestions you get is, well, if you build them out, you must be making a profit, and it must be good for your firm overall. And my response to that would be no. If you're able to do all the work yourself, and you would be perfectly happy to do all the work yourself, and you bill out at, say, $275 an hour, you're willing to take on a student, teach them, invest extra time. It takes a lot longer. You're not billing that extra work that you're teaching them to the client, and you only bill the student out at 100 an hour. You are losing money on that file that you could have made had you done the work, which you are basically doing yourself anyway, because they don't know how to do the work and you're teaching them. So there's a degree to which it's not as simple as just saying, if you're billing them out, you're making a profit, therefore you can afford to pay them. And there are sort of complexities to the argument that have actually been discussed, and that Twitter debate has been good in the sense that, like, it generated discussion, and it generated sort of an article, I think, in the Law Times that went through the issue in a bit more detail. And I've been able to sort of direct people to Thomas Sawell and a few economists that are far smarter than I am to try and say, like, look, this is not a new debate. These issues, there are opportunity costs to everything, and this issue has two sides, that both of which are discussing the marginalized groups. So come on, let's not make this a moral issue, and let's really look at this and try and find the best result with what we have, given that we are also looking at sort of articling more generally and competence more generally with the Competence Task Force and at PDNC.
Yeah, it really is exploded into a moral issue. Like, how dare you support the fact that someone should work for free? I mean, I don't think that's what the committee was saying, but in social media and online and in some of the articles that I've seen, that seems to be the push. You know, I imagine you guys have seen that. Jared, you didn't have an opportunity to speak at Convocation too much on this. I don't think you had an opportunity at all. I know Alexander didn't. You didn't as well.
Joe, I think that it's all about framing. You know, you can frame it as, how dare you force articling students to work for free, or you could say, how dare you prevent an articling student from taking a placement when they can't find one that pays as much as the Law Society says it should pay. I mean, it's all about framing, and Alexander just touched on it. These are not new debates. I mean, you go look online, read some economics textbooks about the introduction of the minimum wage and what it did to certain communities and unemployment rates. I mean, I'm thinking he mentioned Thomas Sowell. Go look up Thomas Sowell on YouTube and hear what he has to say about the impact on Black unemployment rates with the introduction of the minimum wage. Those are the communities that got hurt historically, and eventually, maybe even currently, will be impacted by the erection of a minimum wage by the Law Society of Ontario. But you know, it's an old debate, and I guess the current makeup of Professional Development Competence Committee decided that in the current times, with the pandemic raging and opportunities being diminished, that now is not the time to create artificial regulations and burdens on the positions that remain.
There really seems to be two classes or two sides to the debate, and that one would prefer a minimalistic approach, more competitive, allow the market to do its thing. Let's not overreach, and let's be careful about regulations and the impacts that those might have. And then the other side being, you know, no, we need to do this to protect the vulnerable student that, you know, can't bargain a fair wage and their position, while trying to ensure they get the best experience and you know, and there's enough uptake in terms of jobs for them. So Interesting for sure.
It's easy as a regulator to act in a virtuous way and speak in a virtuous way and do grand noble gestures. But as Alexander said, there's opportunity cost to everything you do. There are downstream costs, and we ought to be measured as a regulator by what are the effects of our policies, not by our grand pronouncements. And so when the last convocation makes a grand pronouncement that, you know, everyone should have a living wage and an articling placement, they ought to be measured on what the downstream effects of that policy are, what it does in the profession and in terms of achieving the public interest. And so I simply ask that people do the same with the current convocation, is measure us on effect, not on the virtue signal.
Is this the worst it's ever been in terms of articling positions that have not been filled, or articling students who have not found articling positions? Do we know what was the worst? How does this compare to the financial crisis or times like that? Was that looked at all?
I don't have that information in front of me, but it generally speaking, there has been a crisis in articling since at least 2015. That's where I was seeing some of the earliest indications of this. But articling has come up as a debate in every convocation. My understanding, going way back, 90s and the 1980s, it's always something that's looked at. And increasingly, it looks like the only obvious solution is to abolish it, notwithstanding the value that I see in it and others. I think you have to abolish it if it's becoming an unfair barrier to entry into the profession where there's no public interest in actually maintaining it. I think abolishment is the way to go. And I've also said out loud and on Twitter that if you continue to put burden upon the remaining placements, you may be achieving that objective. And so those who are trying to save the quality of articling positions may be killing the patient. And that could be the objective. I don't know. Maybe the objective is to do away with articling in a way where we don't actually take a vote on it, but we simply regulate it out of existence.
Yeah, maybe that's the effect of what will happen depending on where it goes next. My understanding, you guys looked at the numbers of articling positions in terms of the breakdown from small firms to larger firms. And I think the vast majority was in solo and small firms that were, 10 lawyers or less, if I recall. Is that right? Do you remember, Alex, or you guys remember those numbers?
We got the pie charts somewhere here. I believe you're correct, but
I mean, that's the profession, right? The profession in Ontario is not on Bay Street. The profession is on Main Street, and that's the makeup of the profession in Ontario. Most lawyers are working as sole practitioners or in law firms of 5 lawyers or less. It's the small town lawyer that is the profession in Ontario. It's not the glass towers that are just south of me. So that would make sense.
Yeah, awesome. Anything else you guys want to add? Anything that we haven't touched on? Anything you didn't get to say at convocation that you want to say nicely here? No? Websites. So Alex, if anyone wants to check out your website, find more information about you and your Twitter handle or LinkedIn, where should they go?
Very good question. My profile is at Alex D. Wilkes on Twitter. That's where I tend to be most active. My website is wilkeslaw.ca, so feel free to check it out and contact me if you need anything. But it was a pleasure chatting with you.
Jared, how about you?
At Litigation Guy. Come and get it.
And your website?
Brownlaw.ca.
All right. Thanks, guys. Thank you for this. And I appreciate the time and the discussion.
Thanks, Joe.